Hello everyone, and welcome to our second lecture on the Pandas library, where we're going to dig a little bit into more advanced syntax and some more complex and more powerful operations, in particular regarding to group-wide operations that we may want to do on our data. So as a quick note, in this class we're not going to be too specific about the distinction in Python between the word method and the word function. For example, the value counts method that we have already mentioned is attached to a data frame object, and that's typically in object-oriented programming. When we use the term method, it is a callable object that is attached to an object, but it is also a function and can be used as a standalone function. And in Python, as it turns out, everything is an object in Python, and regular functions can be attached to objects and become methods. So there's not a fundamental distinction between the two in Python in general, and we'll use those terms interchangeably here. So a very quick review of what we learned in the last lecture. As we discussed, it's useful, I think, to think from a statistical perspective of what is a data frame. As we start thinking about modeling the world, statistically, we think of a problem in the world as something where there is a population that is described by a statistical model, and that conforms to a given distribution, and from which we can draw samples. And each sample has certain properties that we want to study and use to understand that data set at first, and then potentially to make inferences about the world itself. And we represent information from these samples in tabular form quite often, and that is what data frames are for. They are a way of representing this array of data where we have row labels attached to individual samples, and then column labels that are attached to these features. And so this is an example of a data frame that we used throughout the previous lecture. And from a data structures perspective, a data frame is made up of individual columns. The data in these individual columns is one-dimensional data that can be of different types. We can have numerical integer data, we can have floating point data, we can have string information. And that information can belong, for example, to a subset of categories. For example, win and loss may be the only allowable values here, or Democratic, Republican, and Independent may be the only allowable values here, or it can be of arbitrary form, such as the name of the candidates. It can be any string we want. The series, these one-dimensional series, form a data frame when a group of series is joined together with a common indexing structure. And this column right here is what is known as the index. And so these are the three types of data structures that will be dealing with all the time in Pandas. Indices that are these. In this particular case, this index is made of integers, but as we saw, we can have indices that are made of arbitrary labels. One-dimensional series that are the columns of the data frame, and then a group of series that happen to share a common index, which form what we call a data frame, which is this two-dimensional table. And most of what we covered last week were the various ways of getting access to the data stored in a data frame or a series. And we saw that the square bracket operator on the data frame itself is very flexible, but can be a little bit confusing sometimes because it behaves differently in what it gives you as an answer, depending on what you pass it inside of the bracket. So if you give a single name to the square brackets, what you're asking for is to retrieve a column by that name, and you get that column as a standalone series. Now, if you give it a list of names, what you're asking for is a data frame that contains all of those columns, which means that if you want the single series as a data frame, you can pass it a one-element series, as we saw already. And you can also use numerical slices to retrieve information from a data frame. And when you pass numerical slices, what you're asking for is multiple rows. And so the fact that depending on exactly the type of the object that you pass into it, you can get different answers, and whether the data is being pulled row-wise or column-wise, that can be a little bit confusing and can read to hard-to-read code, especially if you think that you might not be seeing the syntax, but you have an object, let's call it X, and you're saying data frame square brackets X. Well, you'd need to know whether the value of x is a single string, is a list of strings, or is a slice. A slice in Python can be stored in a variable. And so depending on which one of those is the value of x, you're going to get completely different answers, and that may be hard to tell from your code at that point in time. So the square bracket operator on the whole data frame is valuable, is useful, is very powerful, but it can be a little bit confusing. Data frames offer two other methods for accessing them, and we'll focus mostly on the lock object, because the lock object is very explicit about treating everything you pass it as a label. And so strings and integers are treated as row and column labels. You can always pass them lists of these things. And you can actually use slices of labels, which is very useful. But one thing to keep in mind is that this is the one place in Python where you will find that a slice is used to represent something from the beginning to the end, including both endpoints. In general, in Python, slices do not include the endpoint. Slices of labels in Pandas do. You can also pass Boolean arrays, and this is in this case what you're asking for is to treat these arrays as masks, and effectively it's a list of row and column labels that are true and false, and you're effectively taking the intersection of those two true sets of true and false and retrieving data only where they're both true. So the rows and columns that are marked by these true-false labels on both. Now, data frames also have the iloc accessor, which refers to integer or positional access. These are always zero-based, regardless of what the index is. Iloc just counts rows-wise or columns-wise from 0 to n-1, from 0 to the number of columns -1. Slices are treated as usual, with the endpoint exclusively being excluded. And you should be careful using iloc because you're explicitly relying on the positional value of those indices. So sometimes there's good reasons to use iloc. You may have computed a set of positions in a calculation, so it's perfectly okay if that was the return of a query, the return value of an operation, that you use it to index into the data frame. But if you explicitly write code where you're saying grab me rows 3, 5, and 7 and columns 2 and 4, well, if at some point in your workflow you change and you add a row or you add a column in between and those numbers change, your code can break. Whereas typically those rows, those columns, for example, might have label names that you may use more reliably. And finally, we saw some handy utilities to summarize a data frame, such as head, size, shape, and describe. So that's a summary of what we saw last week. And today we're going to continue with new syntax and concepts. We're going to look at operations on strings. A lot of data that we store in data frames is made of text, and Pandas has really powerful machinery to manipulate data frames, text information. In data frames, we're going to see how to change the number of columns that data frames have, especially because creating a temporary column can often be a convenient trick where you add a column that you then use as information to sort into the data frame, and then you throw it away afterwards. You delete it back from the data frame. Passing an index as an argument to lock, it turns out that it's a very useful and powerful way to sort a data frame. And very importantly, we're going to dig into the concept of group by, how to do entire group operations on data frames based on values of keys. And a group by is a concept that will take a little bit of time to kind of sink into your heads, but it's extremely useful and powerful, and you really can't do sophisticated work with data frames if you don't wrap your hand around group by. And finally, we'll take a quick look at pivot tables and merging data frames, which are concepts that are actually connected with databases as well. So you'll find echoes of our lectures on SQL in these concepts. So today, what we're going to do is play with all of these ideas and learn about these new features in data frames by trying to solve a few little puzzles. We started on this last time, but we're going to revisit that data set. The data set of baby names that is provided by the Social Security Administration. So we're going to try to answer a few questions, such as what is the most popular name in California in 2018? We already did that, but we'll refresh that quickly. Find, for example, all the names that start with J. sort names by length to find what names is the one whose popularity has changed the most. That'll force us to make that question more precise. And then this particular data set also has gender information stored in it. And so we're going to count the number of female and male babies born in each year in this data set. We'll also take a little bit of a look at our election data set. So first of all, let's take a look at strings. So as a goal, we're going to try to find all the rows whose name starts with the letter J. I'm going to do the same thing as we did before, which is to spend most of our time in the notebook, and you can refer back to the slides for sort of a high-level summary, and they have little screenshots of bits and pieces of the notebooks that we're using, but we're going to mostly focus on using the notebook interactively. So we're going to start by loading this data set. I had already done the download, and we have code in here that checks whether the data is already available locally, so this ran pretty quickly. And let's remember, how did we find the most popular baby name in California in 2018? This was code that we already discussed last time. We asked that the year is equal to 2018. This particular part of the code will produce a Boolean array that filters years that is false where year is some number other than 2018, and it's true where that number is 2018. And so when we index based on that data frame, we get a new data frame, which is now much smaller. And that data frame only has the rows where the year was 2018. Then on that data frame, we call the sort values method, and we say, I want to sort by count, but I want to sort in descending order. So at the very top, I see the most popular names, and let's look at the first 5. And this gives us those first 5 numbers. Let's know that we could do equally well. We could do this also by not having ascending equals false and sorting this way, but instead we look at the tail end of the data frame. This is going to give us the same information, but from the bottom to the top. Maybe a little bit less obvious, but that way you can use the default mode of using sort values. This is just to show that with a lot of these operations on data frames and data tables, there is more than one way to obtain the answer. Okay, so both of these are perfectly valid. They give us the same information, and they use the same sort values method, just with a different ordering. Now let's move on to a new operation, which is to find baby names that start with the letter J. So one option to do this is to write a list comprehension. So one way to do this, let's take a look at our data set again. This is what the names look like. This is how the names are written. You can see that they're capitalized, and this is important because we're going to be checking precisely these names, and so we need to know what letter to look for. And in fact, what we need to look is for the capital J letter. Since a list is something that we can loop over, we can write the following list comprehension. We can ask that X, we can build the list starts with J as X starts with J for X in this series, baby names, name, the name column, right? And so this is going to give us the list of, let's take a look at this, the list of names that start with J. Let's look at the first 20. We saw here that Josephine was right here, and indeed the 4th from the bottom is the first time that we see true. So this seems to be giving us the correct answer. Now, here's an alternative way of computing the same quantity. Let's see what happens. Yep, we get the same answer. And in this case, the only difference is that, let me write this code like this so you see that the rest is identical, is that we change the comparison from being X starts with J to X0 equals J. So I want to comment for a moment on why, on these two alternatives. These are two different ways of doing the same thing. The first one uses the string method starts with. And so let's take a quick look. This is a trick that I want to show you. When in Jupyter Lab you right click on the top tab and you ask for new console for notebook, what you get is this thing down here that also lets you type code that operates on the variables you have defined in the notebook. So for example, starts with J is right there. That's right. Let me grab the first 10 through 20 elements in this one. It is exactly the same data that you have in the notebook, but this is not a notebook. This is not a persistent. So think of this like scratch paper if you want to play with something, but you don't want it permanently recorded in the notebook. We often will make little throwaway cells, do something in the notebook, take a look at the answer, and delete those cells back. A console lets you do that without having to go back and clean up anything. It's literally a new view into the same data that the notebook had, but where the information is not stored in the notebook document. So you can basically explore and do quick tests. And if any of the results you get here are useful, you can copy them into an actual cell and keep them for later. So think of it as scratch paper onto the data of your notebook. So what I want to do is, first of all, do a quick timing comparison between these two approaches. So what happens, how long does this take to run? If you use in Python the magic called %timeit, the underlying IPython kernel will do a very carefully calibrated timing of how long that code takes to run. And so the first thing I want to do is compare how long these two ways of running this code take. Because that tells us something about how Python works. So we see that calling starts with takes about 100 milliseconds per loop, whereas calling, building this index with x0 equals j, checking the first character, takes actually about half that time. Now, you shouldn't obsess about timing in general. There is a maxim in computer science that says early optimization is the root of all evil. And it's very important because it's very easy to get sucked down a rabbit hole of optimizing your code for performance where it doesn't matter. So in general, you should not worry about performance until you actually have performance problems. But I want you to know, how do you get a sense for how long something takes? How do you even find out if something is, or if you're trying to alternative approaches? Well, it turns out that IPython has, the underlying machinery in Jupyter has tools to help you do that. And the timeit magic lets you run a line of code with under the control of a very careful timer that actually calibrates how long things take to compile and whatnot, so that you get accurate timings. So this shows us that direct indexing to the first element of the string is faster. Strings have lots. Let's make a string s called hello world. Strings, if I hit tab completion on it, you can see that strings have lots and lots of methods attached to them, like is lower, is it numeric? So I can ask, is this a numerical string? No, it's not. Is it alpha numerical? Nope. Is it made of ASCII characters? Yes, hello world is made of ASCII characters. For each of these, you can ask, with a question mark, as we saw before, what it is. And by the way, alpha is not short for alphanumeric, it's for alphabetical. And hello world is not alphabetical. Think why that's the case. What is there in hello world that is not alphabetical? And so strings methods like starts with actually take longer in Python to access than direct indexing. However, in general, I think you should try, the main property of your code that you should optimize for is readability. And in general, reading X starts with J conveys very explicitly that you're checking whether the code starts with J, versus X0 equals J, which, yes, relies on the fact that you're indexing the first character. You can think about what that means. It is, if this was a variable, it could be, you could easily change the value and make a mistake, and have and look at a different part. At a different part of the string. So in general, you should try to optimize your code first for readability, and only if you detect a performance difference which is problematic in your use case, then should you worry about going back and optimizing. Code that is highly optimized tends to be much harder to read and understand, and in the vast majority of cases, if you choose the right algorithms, which is often more important than the minute details of the code, if you choose the right overall approach, you will be fine performance-wise and you will have more readable code. So back to how we do this. We've discussed this alternative. So now that we have this mask of the names that starts with J, now we can use it to grab, for example, let's double check as a sanity check. We run this a few times, and every time we run it, we get a different set of names, but they all start with J. So these, we can store this into a variable called the J names, which are these variables. Now, as an alternative, we can use these str objects in data frame. Now, what is str? Well, let's take a look. Let's make this object, baby names, the name series .str. Let's store this in a single variable, and let's actually make a string. So what is S? S is an object called a Pandas core strings string methods. It's a special object called string methods, and let's explore it a little bit. If I hit tab completion on S, I see capitalize, encode, is alpha, is lower, these exact same methods that we were seeing in a string. Let's look at N, which is just a plain Python string, and you see it has the same methods. So the idea in Python, in Pandas, is that series give you a special object called .str, which is a hook that looks like a string, but will do Python string things on the data frame itself. So it gives you string-like methods, but to apply to the entire series or the entire data frame as needed. So it's a very handy and elegant trick to basically help you do text manipulations on your whole data frame. So for example, we can ask on the str object starts with J, and take a look, and we get that exact same mask. So this is another way of asking for this, and now we can do a quick comparison of the three and see how the three compare in terms of performance. Now that we also have the str method. And if you're wondering why it takes longer than a few milliseconds to get these answers, is because this will do the time it magic runs lots and lots of times the same code to get actually a mean and a standard deviation, and so to give you a good estimate of how long it actually takes in practice to run the code. So as we see in this particular case, the top level str method is actually a little slower than the other two. But in general, it tends to produce faster answers than doing things element-wise, because you're telling the whole data frame that you want to apply a given operation to the entire series or the entire data frame, and you let Pandas do that with its own internally optimized code. And so quite often these whole series or whole data frame operations are actually faster. In this particular case, it happens not to be the case, but that is the case. That tends to be the case, and more importantly, they also tend to be more readable, because you're saying on the whole, I want to find out which name starts with J, and just because it starts with is a string operation, we go through here, but that's a very nice way of expressing the overall idea rather than an explicit loop where you manually do that. And this is what is often referred to as declarative code versus imperative code. Declarative code is code where you sort of say, what I want to do is find out from the name column who starts with a J. And you give that to Pandas, and Pandas figures out how to compute that. Whereas this is a much more explicit thing that says, loop over every row in the name column and check whether that entry starts with J. you're explicitly saying how to do it. In general, high-level declarative code on data structures tends to be both more readable and to let you kind of not worry about those details of how to make it happen, and delegate those decisions to those who implemented those data structures and who often know more about how to make that work efficiently than you would know. This is extremely common in the database world. That's exactly how SQL works. When you write SQL code, you provide a high-level query and you let the database engine figure out how to make that work fast, and that's an entire field of research in the database world. Pandas gives you some of the same idea, and this is a general pattern that you should sort of honor. So now that we have this and that we understand this, it becomes also very easy to change and ask other questions, such as what are names that contain the sequence, the substring AD? Very easy. Strings have a contains method, and so you can ask this, and this is a sample of 5 of them. Here, let's split the names on the letter A, and what do we get if we use the letter A as a divider? I mean, it's a bit of an artificial thing to ask for, but we can do so very easily, because in Python strings have a split method. So anything you know how to do with Python strings that you've learned how to do, you can now do on entire data frames. And since text processing is such a common thing to need on the kind of data that we often store in data frames, becoming familiar with these things is extremely useful. So I want you to take a moment to think about this question, and then when you have thought about it and you have actually tested something and written your own code, you can click on the little triangle here in the notebook and see the answer. And it's also in the slides. But I'm going to pause now this segment so that before we continue with the next one, to leave you with this little challenge, and you'll also go and take a look at the quick checks to make sure that you've understood these ideas.